All right, Rabosai, good morning. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors. So thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, the Elbaum Mishpacha, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drashos this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of beloved husband and father Jerry Yaakov Kappel ben Avram Menachem Zichron Lebracha, and to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for Shvat, Mrs. Bracha Strimber, in loving memory of her husband Avi Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Gail and Doug Stanger, in honor of their grandson ETL Mordechai Weinberg, who will Emerz Hashem become a bar mitzvah in Eretz Hashem this coming Shabbos, this coming Thursday, in Eretz Hashem and Shabbos. We thank the Stangers for that dedication. And Moshe Devara Werdesheim for Refuah Shlema for Yara Galit Bas Shai Etel. We open that in the merit of our Talmud Torah. Kol Cholei Yisrael have a complete and enduring refuah. All of the neshamas will have an aliyah, and the Meretz Hashem, we should all have continued nachas from our children as they reach different milestones in their Yiddishkeit. And we'll say with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Ayin Aleph 71. It's a really exciting daf. Today we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Ayin Amud Beis 70b, 4 lines up from the bottom, Amar Ula. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Shlamim sheshachtan me'erev yamtiv, eina yotzei bohem lo mishum simcha v'lo mishum chagiyah. So let's remember again, we were introduced in yesterday's daf to a number of different karbanos that are brought over the course of the regalim. So Ula says over here as follows: that if you have shlamim, you have a regular carbon shlamim that was set aside before yamtiv, and you decide to go ahead and shecht it on erev yamtiv, so one does not fulfill their obligation with that shlamim, neither for shalmei simcha or shalmei chagiga. Remember, we saw this in yesterday's daf. Shalmei chagiga, Rabbi say, is that every single time there is a mitzvah aliyah l'regel, there are certain staple offerings you must bring. Amongst those offerings is what's called shalmei chagiga, special shlamim to accompany, or to called shalmei chagiga, shlamim for the yamtiv. Then there's what's called Shalmei Simcha. Shalmei Simcha, will say, are there to ensure that you have meat every day of Yom Tiv. The mitzvah v'samachta v'chagecha we fulfill with meat, and therefore the Shalmei Simcha are there to provide meat, regular consumption while during the Yom Tiv. So now what Rabbi Elazar is saying is as follows: that if you were to go ahead and shecht a shlamim on erev Yom Tiv, that shlamim cannot count neither towards your Shalmei Chagiga obligation, we'll call your Chagiga obligation, Shalmei Chagiga obligation, nor towards your Shalmei Simcha. So the Gemara explains why. And he also said, "Lo mishum Simcha, v'lo mishum Chagiga." Mishum Simcha, it won't count towards your Shalmei Simcha. Why not? Tichsiv v'zavachta v'samachta. Because the pasuk says, "You shall offer and you shall rejoice." But inon zvicha, top of Ayin Aleph, b'shas Simcha v'leka. The offering must take place at the time of Simcha, and of course that is lacking, because if you're shechting in this particular shlamim prior to Yom Tiv, there is no, it's not yet the Zman of Simcha. The Zman of Simcha is on Yom Tiv itself. So if you're shechting it before Yom Tiv, then by definition you are shechting it before the Zman of Simcha. Chagiga, furthermore, this karban, this shlamim that is shechted on Erev Yom Tiv will not count towards your Shalmei Chagiga. Why not? Have a davar shebechova, because remember again, the Shalmei Chagiga is an obligatory offering. V'chol davar shebechova eno ba'a min hachulin, and any obligatory offering must come from chulin. We'll say, meaning what? Remember, the case over here is you are taking a karban on Erev Yom Tiv that is a shlamim. And now what you're doing is you're taking that shlamim and you're trying to repurpose it, either for the sake of Shalmei Simcha or Shalmei Chagiga. It won't work, says Rabbi Elazar, because for Shalmei Simcha, because Shalmei Simcha v'zavachta v'samachta. You can only fulfill your obligation for Shalmei Simcha during the time of Simcha, i.e. on Yom Tiv itself. You're shechting this karban on Erev Yom Tiv, therefore it won't work. Furthermore, it can't work for your Shalmei Chagiga. Why not? Because Shalmei Chagiga are an obligatory offering. An obligatory offering cannot come from previously consecrated animals. It has to come from something that is chulin and now being used to satisfy your obligation. But to use something that was already dedicated for a particular sacrificial purpose and now repurpose it for Shalmei Chagiga will not work. So since over here you're dealing with an animal that is already a shlamim on Erev Yom Tiv, you cannot fulfill your obligation for Shalmi Chagiga with an animal that was already consecrated for a different purpose. So let's bring a proof. So we'll say this is the Shita of Rabbi Elazar, at least as it's stated now. We'll see an alternate version of this in just a little bit, but as it's being stated now, Halacha L'Mais Rabbi Elazar is saying, is if you shecht a shlamim on Erev Yom Tiv, and you want it to count for your Shalmi Chagiga or for your Shalmi Simcha, it doesn't work either way. Let's support this idea. We'll say an interesting Gemara. V'ha'isa ach sameach. The pasuk says by Sukkis, Vayisa ach sameach, and you will be joyful. Now, we'll say the word ach is extra there, and therefore comes to make a drasha. Rabos leili yom tov achron l'simcha. So we'll say Vayisa ach sameach. You will really, the way the pasuk reads is, you will also be b'simcha. The ach, the also, comes to include Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres, literally in the last night of Yom Tov, that there's a mitzvah of simcha on Shmini Atzeres as well. So the Gemara says, Ata Omer Leile Yom Tov Achrona Eile O Eino Elele Yom Tov Rishon. So how do you know? Maybe why do you assume that it comes to include Shmini Atzeres? Maybe it's coming to teach you that there's a mitzvah of simcha on the first night of Yom Tov. Talmud Lomar Ach Chilek. Therefore, the pasuk Ach comes ultimately again to distinguish. Shabbos says, interestingly enough, the word Ach is coming to include, according to the Gemara now, coming to include the night of Shmini Atzeres and coming to exclude the first night of Yom Tov. That on the first night of Yom Tov there is no mitzvah of Simcha. The Gemara says, my time, why would the first night of Yom Tov be excluded from the biblical obligation of Simcha? Lav mishum de'ein lo b'ma yismach. So we'll say this is incredible. The Gemara says very simple. We'll say, remember again, when the Torah speaks out simcha is a reference to what? Reference to what? Meat. What type of meat? Sacrificial meat. So the Gemara says that makes a lot of sense. You can't have a mitzvah of simcha on the first night. Why not? Why not? There's no way to have Shalmei Simcha on the first night of Yom Tiv. Why is there no way to have Shalmei Simcha? Because they both say you can't shech the karbanos once Yom Tiv start because you don't have karbanos that night. Furthermore, based on what Rabbi Elazar just said, you also can't what? You can't shech Shalmei Simcha on Erev Yom Tiv either, right? Shalmei Simchas or Shalmei Simchas, I guess Shalmei Simcha that are shechted on Erev Yom Tiv don't count for the obligation of Shalmei Simcha on Yom Tov itself. Therefore, it must be that the first night of Yom Tov technically has no obligation of Simcha, simply because you can't go ahead now. Say, you should give me a puzzled look. You following this? No, you can't. You can't shech karbanos at night. First night of Yom Tov. First night of Yom Tov. Remember, I will say, to be very clear, we're talking about one very specific time. So it must be, Avayisa Ach Sameach is coming to include Shmini Atzeres night, because Shmini Atzeres night, I can't have Shalmei Simcha. Why? I can shecht it that day. Because that day, remember, we call it Oshan Rabbah, the last day of Sukkot. So I could do that. But it could very well be that maybe on the first night of Yom Tiv, there is no biblical obligation of Simcha, only because, according to Elazar, there is no way to have, remember again, we're defining Simcha in a very narrow scope. That Simcha means Shalmei Simcha. Interestingly enough, on the first night of Yom Tiv, there's just no way to have Shalmei Simcha. You can't shecht it at night, because we don't shecht karbanos at night, and you can't shecht it on Erev Yom Tiv, because Rabbi Elazar says you can't do Shalmei Simcha on Erev Yom Tiv. To which the Gemara says, lo, it's not what it means. Lo, keditani taima. The Gemara says there's another reason why Vayisa Ach Sameach includes Shmini Atzeres and not the first night. Marois l'rabos leili Yom Tov achron, or lahotzi leili Yom Tov arishon. Why would you think to include the night of Shmini Atzeres and exclude the first night of Simcha from the mitzvah of Yom Tov? Mar bani leili Yom Tov ha'acharon sheish Simcha lefanov, umotzi ani leili Yom Tov harishon she'in Simcha lefanov. Is a different cheshbon, nothing to do with Shalmei Simcha. It makes sense to include the last night of Yom Tov, meaning Shmini Atzeres night, because it is preceded by days of Simcha, and to exclude the first night of Yom Tov, which is not precluded from any time of Simcha. So the Gemara therefore says that halacha l'maisa has nothing to do with Shalmei Simcha. In other words, the Mitzias may be true, which is that Shmini Atzeres night has a mitzvah of Simcha, and maybe the first night of Yom Tov doesn't have Mitzvah Simcha. We'll see, we don't paskin this way. There's a Mitzvah Simcha already on the first night of Yom Tov, we just fulfill it in different ways. But even if you want to go with this idea that there is no Mitzvah on the first night of Yom Tov, maybe it has nothing to do with Shalmei Simcha. Maybe it just has to do with the fact that it makes sense to include the night of Shmini Atzeres, because the previous 7 days had Simcha. So it makes sense to be mamshich, to continue that Simcha through the end of Yom Tov. Versus on the first night of Yom Tov, which is the brand new beginning, there is no preceding mitzvah of Simcha. So perhaps the mitzvah of Simcha doesn't actually begin until the next day. Again, we'll come back to the Simcha idea, but either way, remember, the Gemara is trying to bring this as a rayat Rebbe Lazar. So Rebbe Lazar is saying that halacha l'maisa, you cannot go ahead and shecht a shlomim on Erev Yom Tiv and have that count towards either your Shalmei Chagiga or your Shalmei Simcha. Master Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef raised the question of Elazar, Chagigas arba'asa yotze ba mishum Simcha ve'ein yotze bo mishum Chagiga. Wow, so the Gemara says, Rav Yosef brings a Raisa, and it says that a Chagiga that you offer up on the 14th. And I will say, what does that mean, a Chagiga you offer up on the 14th? There's no Chagiga on the 14th. What it means is, Ishlamim, that you offer up as a Chagiga on Erev Yom Tiv. Halacha l'maisa, Rav Yosef says that it works. Yotzei ba mishum Simcha, it could count towards your Shalmei Simcha. But remember again, our terms here are very important. The Shalmei Simcha are just the animals that you shecht over the course of Yom Tiv. They're shlamim to provide you with meat. So it satisfies your obligation for Shalmei Simcha, but it will not work for Chagiga, for your Shalmei Chagiga. Says the Gemara, but one second. Amai, why should it work for Shalmei Simcha? Remember, Rabbi Elazar said what? V'zavachta v'samachta. V'zavachta v'samachta. You could only go ahead and do the zvicha, offer up the carbon at the time of Simcha and Yom Tov itself. Va'amai, says the Gemara, haba inon zvicha b'shas Simcha v'leka. Ravidi bar Avin she'ikev v'shachta. No. What's the case? You're right. The case that they're referring to over here is a shlamim that you designated on Erev Yom Tiv, but in fact you didn't end up shechting it until Yom Tiv itself. So it's not really a raya for or against Rebbe Elazar. I'm Rav Ashi Yachanai Mistabra. This appears to be clear. Di'ilo temach, because if you don't say this, Hamas Nisa Man Katani. Who is the author of this price? Ben Tema. It's Ben Tema. Ben Tema hapasla la belina. And I will say Ben Tema ultimately, again, as we will discuss, invalidates a carbon like this with lina remaining overnight. Shmamina, ultimately, again, therefore it must be, we'll discuss this shita of Ben Tema in just a little bit. So the Gemara says, therefore you see from here that the case in the Braisa is not a case where you actually shechted the shlamim on Erev Yom Tiv, but rather it's where you designated the shlam on Erev Yom Tiv, didn't end up shechting it ultimately again until Yom Tiv itself. Okay? Because you also remember again, just very simply, according to Ben Tema, if you were to go ahead and shecht it on Erev Yom Tiv, that carbon would become invalidated over the course of that first night, which would then preclude you ultimately from eating it over the rest of the day of the 15th. So therefore the Gemara says, ultimately, not a shaila. Masiv Rava. So Rava raises another kasha. Interesting case. Hahalel v'simcha shmona. Let's listen to this. For Yom Tiv, the mitzvah of halal and simcha extend over all 8 days. All 8 days. Remember again, the 8th days, of course, is reference to Sukkis. Remember, we'll say again, without getting into it now, but remember, Sukkis is comprised of Sukkis and Shmini Atzeres, and in certain respects, they are looked at as one Yom Tiv, one unit of Yom Tiv. In other respects, Shmini Atzeres is looked at as a Ragel Bifnei Atzmo, a Yom Tiv onto itself. So the Gemara understands over here as follows. So you have Halal v'Simcha Shmona. So over the course of Sukkot, there's an obligation of Halal and Simcha over all 8 days. So says the Gemara, Vi Amrit Ba'ino Zvicha B'Sham Simcha. Then Rabbi, if you go with Rabbi Elazar's approach, that you require Zvicha B'Shas Simcha, which means that you could only go ahead and offer up your Shalmei Simcha on Yom Tov itself. You'll have many times where you won't have 8 days of Simcha. Remember again, the Gemara is assuming that the definition of Simcha is what? Consumption of Shalmei Simcha. We have a very narrow scope of Simcha right now. So now I have a Gemara that tells me that Allah Chalamayis the mitzvah of Simcha, i.e. consumption of Shalmei Simcha, applies 8 days. Gemara says, well, one second, that's not necessarily true. Because if you subscribe to Rabbi Elazar's idea of Vizavachta v'samachta. That ultimately, again, it is only during the time of Simcha and Yom Tiv that you could shech Shami Simcha, so then you may have many situations where the mitzvah of Simcha will only apply for 7 days. For example, where the Gemara says, Kigon shechal Yom Tov Rishon lios b'Shabbos. What's a very simple case? If the first day of Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, then what? Everyone agrees, Rabbi said, when the first day of Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, then what? You can't shecht Shalmei Simcha on Shabbos. Right, Rabbi said there are karbanos that are docha Shabbos, but not Shalmei Simcha. So you could easily have, and and by the way, there's always a Shabbos over the course of Sukkot, right? So really, when do you ever have, or if you accept the principle of v'zavachta v'samachta, that ultimately you could only offer up Shalmei Simcha on Yom Tov itself, and you define that the mitzvah of Simcha is consumption of Shalmei Simcha, then halacha l'maisa, you're not going to have 8 days of Simcha. By definition, Shabbos is on one of those days, and you can't offer up Shalmei Simcha, to which the Gemara says, Amrav Huna Breid Rav Yehuda, Mesamcho b'sirei haragolim. Interesting enough, Rabbi says, in that case, on Shabbos, essentially, what we do is we go ahead and the simcha is provided through the seirei haragolim. Rabbi said the seirei haragolim is a reference to the chatos offerings, the chatos atzibor, right? The communal chatos offerings that are offered up, those provide the simcha. So Gemara says, what? There's two problems with that approach. Problem number one, chada, the seirei haragolim chay ne'echolin, it's li'ei ne'echolin, v'simcha b'chayleka. First of all, say, when you offer up that chatos, that it's true, you're allowed to offer up those communal chatos offerings on Yom Tiv, but you can't prepare the meat. You can't cook the meat. So how do you eat it? So the only way to eat it would be to eat it raw. Well, to eat raw meat does not satisfy the mitzvah of simcha. The mitzvah of simcha is only satisfied if one eats cooked meat. Furthermore, so we'll say, so number one is, even if you want to say that the chatos at Tzibur could go ahead and provide the simcha on Shabbos, on Yom Tov that falls on Shabbos, remember the only license I have with the chatos is to shecht it, not to prepare it. The mitzvah of simcha is through consumption, and it's only called the mitzvah de consumption if what? If halacha l'maisa, it's prepared, but you can't prepare it on Shabbos. Furthermore, second question, va'od, kohanim ochlin. Well, so the only people who eat the chatas are the kohanim. So it's very nice for the kohanim. The Yisra b'masmechim, and what will the Yisraelim? How do they find their simcha on this Shabbos of Yom Tiv? Ela amra papa mesemcho b'ksus nikia v'yayin chadash. So which Rav Papa says the mitzvah of simcha need not only be fulfilled with sacrificial meat, but the mitzvah of simcha could be fulfilled in other ways as well. For example, ksus nikia, clean clothing, and good wine, or aged wine. Aged wine. So we'll say this is very important. So the Gemara says, even if you adopt Rabbi Elazar's principle, which is v'zavachta v'samachta, that ultimately, again, Shalmei Simcha could only be shechted on Yom Tiv itself, right? B'shas Simcha. It doesn't mean to say that the only mechanism for Simcha are karbanos. In other words, in the absence of karbanos, there are other opportunities as well. So therefore, technically speaking, if you were to have a situation where Shalmei Simcha could not be offered up, and I will say, this loops back. For example, we paskin that halacha l'maisa on the first night of Yom Tiv, there is a mitzvah of simcha. So what happens if you hold the Rabbi Elazar's principle of v'zavachta v'samachta? So then so remember again, on the first night of Yom Tiv, you're going to be a little bit stuck. Because according to Rabbi Elazar, you can't offer up Shalmei Simcha on Erev Yom Tiv. So how do you have simcha on the first night of Yom Tiv, according to Rabbi Elazar? And the answer is a good bottle of wine. A good bottle of wine, right? That's the answer to many of life's problems. So I'll say a good bottle of wine. Halacha l'maisa, again, Rabbi Elazar says you could go ahead and have simcha like that. Or ksus nikia, a nice article of clothing. Good. So now the Gemara, ki as Ravin, Rabbi Elazar. So we'll say, now Ravin comes along and offers up an alternate version of Rabbi Elazar. And we'll say the opposite version. Rabbi Elazar, shlamim sheshachtan me'erev yamtiv, yotzei bahem mishum simcha, so we'll say now, in this version of Rabbi Elazar pivots a little bit in one area. But remember again, in the first version of Rabbi Elazar, Ula's version of Rabbi Elazar held that shlamim that are shachted on Erev Yom Tiv cannot count neither for Shalmei Chagiga or for Shalmei Simcha. In Ravin's version, we pivot a little bit. Shlamim sheshachtam le'erev yamtiv, yotzei bahem mishum simcha, ve'yotzei bahem mishum chagiga. But let's say a little bit of an alternate version. In this version, Rabbi Elazar holds, if you shecht shlamim on erev yamtiv, they can count towards your shalmei simcha, but not towards your shalmei chagiga. So we'll say, remember again the distinction. Shalmei chagiga are part of the sacrificial order of aliyah l'regel. Shalmei simcha are there to ensure that you have a proper supply of meat. So also we even hear a distinction. So therefore Rabbi Elazar will say, I can go ahead and shech the shlamim on erev yamtiv for shalmei simcha, not for shalmei chagiga. Let's explain. So the Gemara says, so why is it that if you shech the shlam on erev yamtiv, you could be yotzi because of shalmei simcha? Very simple. Lo ba'inar zvicha b'shas simcha. But I'll say it's a very simple cheshbon, because halacha l'mais, Rabbi Elazar holds, we don't darshan v'zavachta v'samachta. We don't darshan that v'zavachta v'samachta. That halacha l'mais, again, you don't require zvicha b'shas simcha. V'lo mishum chagiga. However, again, you cannot go ahead and fulfill your obligation for chagiga, shalmei chagiga. Why not? Havi davar shebechova, v'chol davar shebechova eino ba ela min achulin. Because this goes back to what we said before. This piece of logic remains intact. I will say, whenever you bring an obligatory offering must come from a chulin, an unconsecrated animal. The problem with going ahead and taking a shlamim on erev Yom Tov and using it for shalmei chagiga is you're taking an animal that is already, we'll call it sacrificially purposed in one direction, and now you're repurposing it in another direction. That doesn't work. So therefore, I will say again, according to this version, which we'll see is the version that the Rambam accepts, we'll see inside in just a moment. Halacha l'maisa, you can shecht a shlamim on erev yamtiv, and it could count towards your shalmei simcha, but not towards your shalmei chagiga. Which I will say, by the way, now we're going to see the rest of the conversation flows into this. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, going to raise a kasha, first wide line, Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph, At Vayisa Ach Sameach. The pasuk says you should be b'simcha. Now remember, ach comes to include/exclude. So the Gemara says, "L'rabos leili Yom Tov achron l'simcha." In this case, it comes to include the last night of Yom Tov, the night of Shmini Atzeres, that there is a mitzvah of simcha on the night of Shmini Atzeres. Sa'at omer l'rabos leili Yom Tov achron ina el l'rabos leili Yom Tov arishon. So we'll say, you say he's coming to include the last night of Yom Tov. Maybe he's coming to include the first night of Yom Tov. To which the Gemara says, Talmud lomar ach chilek. My taima. Why is that? Lav mishum de'ilma ma'isa. So we'll say, why would you say that the first night of Yom Tov is not included in the mitzvah of simcha? So b'pashtos, it's because maybe you have nothing to be b'simcha with. Kidisanya. So we'll say, so remember again, why do you have nothing to be b'simcha with? Because you might have thought, again, there is no ability to have shalmei simcha on the first night of Yom Tov. Kidisanya. Umarois l'rabos leili Yom Tov achron l'hoti Yom Tov rishon. To which we'll say, so ultimately we say that's not the case. Rather, why is it that we come to include the last night of Yom Tov over the first night of Yom Tov? U'lehotzi leili Yom Tov rishon mar ba'ani leili Yom Tov achron sheish simcha lefanav umoti ani leili Yom Tov rishon shein simcha lefanav. So we'll say ultimately the Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, I come to go ahead and include the last night of Yom Tov because it has been preceded by 7 days of Yom Tov. So again, logically, it makes sense to be mamshich it, to continue it, as opposed to the first day of Yom Tov, which is panim chadoshos ba'ala, kind of new simcha. There's no simcha that preceded. I will say, we passing that halacha l'maisa. That there is a mitzvah of Yom Tov. There's a mitzvah of Simcha even on the first night of Yom Tov. But now it makes sense because we're also going to be passing like this version of Rabbi Elazar, which is that you can shecht shalmei simcha on erev Yom Tov. Also, let me show you the Rambam here for just a moment. So the Rambam, this is in Hilchos Chagiga. Hilchos Chagiga, Perek Beis Halacha Yud Aleph. Here we go. Misha hayulo shalmei neder onedava. So we'll say, what I want to point out over here is something very interesting. You see, the way the Rambam is setting up this case is you have to imagine the following scene. When you come to Yerushalayim for the regalim, you're bringing karbanos with you, bepashtos, right? Because over the course of the year, you have karbanos you have to bring. So maybe it's a chatos, hopefully not. You have to bring a chatos. But again, other times I have shalmei neder o nedava. I just have gifto. I made a neder, I made a nedava. So we'll say, now watch this. So I'm bringing shalmei neder and nedava. So now I have to offer these up. So what the halacha is saying is like something, v'shachtam erev yamtiv, and I shachtam on erev yamtiv, afa pisha achlam b'yamtiv, eino yotze bahen yedei chovas chagiga, she'eino ba ela min achulin. Aval yotza ba yedei chovas simcha. So I'll say here the Rambam says explicitly, like Ravin's version of Rebbe Lazar, that halacha l'maisa, if you shecht a shlamim before Yom Tiv, it can't count for your shalmei chagiga. Why not? Because Rebbe say obligatory Yom Tiv offerings can only come from chulin, and remember these karbanos are already consecrated as a shlamim, so it won't work for shalmei chagiga, but it will work for shalmei simcha. Will work for Shalmei Simcha. Why? Because you see from the Rambam, we don't paskin like this drasha of v'zavachta v'samachta, that the shechita does not have to happen b'shas simcha b'shas yom tov. The Rambam goes on in Halach Yud Beis, afal pisha shachtam kod b'regel, hol v'ochel mehen b'regel, yatsa yidei chavasa she'enu tzarach lishchot Shalmei Simcha b'shas simcha. Here it says it explicitly. So Halach l'maisa, so we'll say Halach l'maisa, you don't have to shech Shalmei Simcha b'shas simcha, and therefore you check on Erev Yom Tiv. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, and this is halacha l'maisa, you could check the shlamim Erev Yom Tiv, it will not count towards your shalmei chagiga, but it will count towards your shalmei simcha. And therefore, I will say, kind of everything flows together. That's why there is a mitzvah of Yom Tiv on the first night of Yom Tiv in general. And again, because now we know you could fulfill that with meat, you do have sacrificial meat, you do have shalmei simcha, or you could have Shalmei Simcha even on the first night of Yom Tiv. But even in the absence of Shalmei Simcha meat, there are other ways to fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha, Yayin Yashan, Ksus Nikia, old wine, clean clothing, so on and so forth. But I'll just mention that although we reject the drasha of Vizavachta, Visamachta, ultimately, again, mitzad halacha, it is absolutely halacha l'maisa mitzad hashkafa. Right? They'll say, what's the hashkafa? What's the outlook of v'zavachta v'samachta? They'll say, if you want real simcha in life, you have to be willing to engage a v'zavachta, to sacrifice something. You see, often in life, we want to have everything. You can't have everything. For one simple reason, not everything is good for me. And success in life comes from knowing what are the things I have to hold on to, and what are the things I have to sacrifice. Because sacrifice we often look at as a bad word, but a lot of times there are things that are holding me back in life. But I want them, I like them, I'm used to them, but they're holding me back. So unless I find the koach of v'zavachta to give them up, I'm never really going to come to v'samachta. Because true simcha in life comes from leading a life of accomplishment, from leading a life of self-actualization, from becoming the best version of myself. But we all know I can only do that as if v'zavachta, if halach l'maisa, I'm willing to sacrifice and let go of the things which are holding me back in life. So it might not be halacha l'maisa, but v'zavachta v'samachta, that mantra Rabosai is certainly hashkafa l'maisa. So the Gemara goes right. Amar Rav Kahana. So we'll say another incredible Gemara. So Amar Rav Kahana, minayin le'emurei chagigas chamishasar shenifsalin belina. So we'll say, how do I know that the emurin? So we'll say, remember again, these are emurin are the leftover sacrificial parts. So how do I know that the leftover sacrificial parts of the chagiga offered up on the 15th are nifsal belina? Now I will say, look at Rashi for just a moment. Le'imuri chagigas tezvav shenesal belina v'afa pi shezman achilas b'sara kol yamachar. So we'll say, so remember again, if you offer up a chagiga on the 15th, a regular chagiga has a consumption of window of 2 days and 1 night. So you could eat it. You could eat it the 15th, the night of the 16th, the day of the 16th, up until nightfall of the 17th. But interestingly enough, the sacrificial parts ultimately, again, must be burned by the night of the 16th. So although it's interesting, so although you have 2 days, a 2 day window, a 2 day consumption window, you must burn the sacrificial parts by the end of the night after the first day of consumption. Shne'emar v'lo yolin chelev chagi ad boger. Because the pasuk says you shall not leave over, literally again, the fats of my Yom Tiv until morning. V'samich lei reishis, and afterwards the pasuk says reishis lemeimra, the high boker, that the boker being referred to in the pasuk is boker rishon, is the first morning. So therefore, what we're learning over here is as follows: imagine you offer up the chagiga on the 15th. So you have the date, let's say the morning of the 15th. You have the morning, you have the day of the 15th, the night of the 16th, and the day of the 16th to eat the carbon, right? It's only once the day of the 16th ends, we'll call it nightfall of the 17th, you can't eat the carbon. Yet, interestingly enough, the sacrificial parts must be burned by the morning of the 16th. Very interesting. So the sacrificial parts must be burned before the morning of the 16th. So they must be burned even before the window of consumption closes. So the Gemara says, how do I know that? Because boker reishis. The Gemara says, lemeimra, the high boker rishon. To say that when the Torah says you have to burn the sacrificial parts by the boker, by the morning, it's reference to the first morning, not the second morning. Maske for Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef raises the kasha, taima de kasiv reishis, halo kasiv reishis. So we'll say the only reason we say that is because it says boker, and then the next pasuk it says reishis, the first. So therefore I dash that you have to burn the sacrificial parts by the first morning, which again, for our purposes, this is the morning of the 16th. The Gemara said, "Halo kasiv reishis," but if it wouldn't have said reishis, hava amina my boker, I would have thought, what's boker? Boker sheni. I would have thought that boker means boker sheni, and that halacha lamaisa, when do you have to burn the sacrificial parts? And well, I could eat it on the 15th, I could eat it on the 16th, and boker perhaps would mean until the morning of the 17th. I have to just get the sacrificial parts burned by the morning of the 17th. Mi'ika midi, the basra if sile me'arta, ve'imor not safra. But is there such a thing as a carbon where you can't eat it? Already by evening you can't eat it, but yet you still have more time to burn the sacrificial parts until the next morning. In other words, let's say, is that even like a tenable suggestion? That Allah Chalamaisa, I can only go ahead and eat the meat up until nightfall of the 17th, but there's a havamina that you could burn the sacrificial parts until the morning of the 17th? Abai said, why not? Vari Pesach, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the basra if salei mechatzos. What about Pesach? According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds that you could only eat the carbon Pesach up until midnight. Up until midnight. And after midnight, any meat that's left over after chatzos becomes pasul. And yet, ve'imurin atzafra. Yet, halacha l'maisa, you are allowed to go ahead and burn, you have until the morning to burn the sacrificial parts. To which the Gemara says, Amarava Rav Yosef hachika kashile. This is Rav Yosef's kasha. Mi ika midi de ilutana lebasar lo bay reishis. Rav kahana le'imurin bay reishis. Rav say, they were bothered by was as follows. When it comes to the consumption of the meat, you don't darshan reishis, right? When it comes to the consumption of the meat, you take it for granted that you have 2 days. Yet when it comes to the burning of the sacrificial parts, that's where you apply reishis, to say that the sacrificial parts must be burned by the first morning, not the second morning. So we'll say what the Gemara is just intrigued by is this distinction in the application of the drashas. So the Gemara says, Maihi, so what's the drasha you're referring to? This Sanya, Yilo Yolin min Abbas Rasha Tizbach le'Ereb Yom HaRishon. So the pasuk says over here, the pasuk says, V'lo Yolin min Abbas Rasha Tizbach be'Ereb Yom HaRishon laboker. Literally translated, you shall not go ahead and leave over from the meat that you have sacrificed in the evening, Bayom Harishon Laboker, from the first day until the morning. Amid Beis, Limeid al Chagigas Yud Dalid. So we'll say this comes to teach us about a Chagiga that was offered up on Yud Dalid, that it could be consumed for 2 days and 1 night. Or maybe you would say it's only offered up, or only it's maybe for 1 day and 1 night. Kishu Omer Bayom Arishon Laboker. So when it says on the first day until the Boker, Hari Boker Sheni Amar, that refers to the second morning, teaching you that the Chagigas Yudal, the Chagigo offered up on the 14th, Halacha Lamaisa could be consumed for 2 days and 1 night. Oh, Eino Ella Boker Rishon. Maybe not. Maybe Boker means the Boker of the first day. But one second, I will say, how could you say that Boker only means the first day? We have a klal that the Chagiga could be consumed for 2 days and 1 night. So the Gemara says, so man mekayim chagiga ne'acheles l'sham v'layla echad. What does it mean when saying that chagiga could be consumed for 2 days and 1 night? Chutz mizu. I will say perhaps this is the exception. Perhaps chagiga that is offered up on Yudalid has a shorter window of consumption than a general chagiga. Kishu omer bo im neder onedava when the pasuk says in neder unedava, if you look at Rashi says kishu omer in neder bachila shlamim shnei yamim in neder unedava. So we'll say when it says neder unedava, which we know again is consumed for 2 days. Limeid achagigus yudalid shnei chelis l'shnei yom v'layla echad. It teaches me that halacha l'maisa chagigus yudalid is also consumed for 2 days and 1 night. Amar mar o eino ela boker rishon. But again, I will say, how do I know? So we'll say, you see what's happening over here? There's an interesting application. On one hand, when it comes to the sacrificial parts, we're using boker to teach me boker rishon, that the sacrificial parts must be burned by the first morning. But yet, interestingly enough, the chagiga itself, when we see boker, we assume boker doesn't mean the first morning. That the chagiga has the full window of consumption, which is 2 days and 1 night. So Amar mar, ina ela boker rishon. I'm sorry. Amar mar, o eino ela boker rishon. Maybe boker means that even the chagigas yodalit can only be consumed until the first morning. Ha'amrit, the Gemara says, kishu omer biyom harishon hari boker sheni amar. But when it says biyom harishon, it's telling me that what? That I have until the second morning. Hachikamer, this is what it means to say. Oh, eina ela b'shtei chagigas hakasim medaber. Maybe the pasuk is making reference to 2 chagigas. What are the 2 chagigas? Achos chagigos yudalid, va'achos chagigas tasvav. Both say maybe we're making a distinction between a chagiga offered up on the 14th and a chagiga offered up on the 15th. What's the distinction? V'zula bokra. They have 2 different bokers. Maybe the chagigas yudalid has to be consumed by the first morning, and the chagigas tasvav has until the second morning. Hadar amar ela dekaim alon chagiga nechelis l'shnei yom v'layla echad. But what about the fact that we have a general principle that says that a chagiga can be consumed for 2 days and 1 night? Im kain im neder onadava b'mai. If that's the case, we'll say neder onadava, which is the juxtaposition, which teaches me that a carbon can be consumed for 2 days and 1 night. What is that coming to include? I chagigos yadalit haksiv ba yom v'layla. If it's talking about a chagigas yodal, the pasuk says day and night. I chagigas tesvav haksiv ba yom v'layla. So Moshe said, I don't need neder unedava to include anything else. Ela hayle chagigas tesvav. Rather, you have to say that the pasuk is coming to include the chagiga that is offered up on the 15th. Veheich kulei kra lechagigas yodalid. And the other pasuk is coming to include the chagiga offered up on the 14th. And therefore, lime al chagigos yodalid shnei chelis l'shnei yomim v'layla echad. Ultimately coming to teach you that even a chagiga offered up on the 14th has a regular chagiga window of consumption, which is 2 days and 1 night. Taima dechsiv bayom harishon laboker. The my boker sheni. But the reason that's because it says bayom harishon laboker. And the boker that we're referring to ultimately again is boker sheni, the second morning. The Gemara says, ha kolecha dechsiv boker stama boker rishon. The afagav delo kasav bei reishis. But he would infer from this that in any other context where it says boker, he would ultimately again assume that halacha l'maisa boker means boker rishon. So we'll say, so bottom line, halacha l'maisa, what comes out of this is carbon chagiga always has the same window of consumption. And the window of consumption is 2 days and 1 night. Whether that carbon ultimately again is offered up on the 14th or it's offered up on the 15th, the window of consumption of 2 days and 1 night is always going to be the same. Now, I will say, that being said, the obligation to offer up the sacrificial parts is a smaller window, narrow window, less time to offer up the sacrificial parts than consumption. Halacha l'maisa, sacrificial parts will have to be burned by the first morning, even though halacha l'maisa, the window of consumption for the chagiga itself extends up to the second morning. Beautiful. We'll say that's that. Now you have the construct ultimately. So we'll say, so again, we emerge with an incredible amount of halacha l'maisa. We emerge ultimately again with the version of Rebbe Lazar according to Ravin. We emerge ultimately again Shami Simcha could be offered up at Erev Yom Tov. Shami Chagiga cannot. We reject V'zavachta v'samachta halachically, although we go ahead and accept it hashkafically. We go ahead in the window for consumption of carbon chagiga, whether it's chagiga that is offered up on the 14th or the 15th, is going to be 2 days and 1 night. But the obligation to burn the sacrificial parts will be by the first morning. In other words, whenever you offer it up, you have to burn the sacrificial parts by the end of that first night. Beautiful. Let's go a little bit weiter. HaPesach sheshachtu shelo lishmo. So what's an interesting case here? So if you have a Pesach, so we'll say we're going to get into over here the concept of what's called ta'a bidvar. Well, let's see. So Pesach sheshachtu shelo lishmo b'Shabbos chayav alav chata. So we'll say if you shecht a korban Pesach shelo lishmo. So what's happening over here is you shecht the korban Pesach on Shabbos. Now remember, we've already established you're allowed to shecht the Pesach on Shabbos. That halacha l'maisa is absolutely permitted. In this case over here, you're shechting the Pesach shelo lishmo. So you're shechting it not for korban Pesach, for some other purpose. Now we'll say, that's not allowed. And if you do that on Shabbos, chayav alav chatos. Assuming you did it b'shogeg, you're in violation of Shabbos, you have to bring a chatos. U'sha'ar kol azvachim sheshachton l'shem Pesach. Similarly, if you shechted any other korban on Shabbos, but you did it l'shem Pesach, im einon ru'uyin chayav, if let's say also you shechted a calf, or you shechted an animal more than a year old, a sheep more than a year old, so it's not really fit for Pesach, then halacha l'maaseh chayav chatos, because you did something illegal on Shabbos, albeit unknowingly. Ve'im ru'uyin hein, we'll say, what happens if halacha l'maaseh, you went ahead and you shechted, you had a sheep, and the sheep ultimately again was designated for a different korban, but you went ahead and shechted it on Shabbos l'shem Pesach. So ve'im ru'uyin hein, Rabbi Elazar mechayiv chatos. Rabbi Elazar says you're still chayiv chatos. You chayiv chatos because you still violated Shabbos. You took an animal consecrated for something else and you offered it up for Pesach. Rabbi Yeshua poter. Rabbi Yeshua ultimately again says that you're poter. And I'm about to say, if you look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says already this is 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down in the wide lines of Rashi. Rabbi Yeshua poter. Tekasavar ta'a bidvar mitzvah va'asa mitzvah kol duhu poter mechiv chatas. So I'm about to say, the Gemara is going to get into this, but this is going to be the fascinating sugya of what we call ta'a bidvar mitzvah. So we'll say ta'a bidvar mitzvah means like this, that when you do something mistakenly, you make a mistake, but your mistake has the framework of a proper mitzvah. So Rabbi Yoshua is going to be of the opinion that there is no liability for that. So for example, if you took a sheep that was within a year, which is a proper carbonic animal for korban Pesach, and you go ahead but you had it designated for a chatos, but on Shabbos you shechted l'shem Pesach, Rabbi Yoshua says that's called Torah b'dvar mitzvah. You made a mistake, but you made a mistake in the context of the proper performance of a mitzvah, you're pater. So we'll say we'll have to define the parameters of that in the Gemara. Amar li Rabbi Elazar, ma'im Pesach shu mutar l'shmo kishashina shmo chayiv. So Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shua, that makes no sense. If you had an animal designated as a Pesach, but you ended up offering it up for a different purpose on Shabbos, you'd be chayiv v'chatos. Zvachim she'nasurun l'shmon. Therefore, Rabbi say, let's say you took an animal that was designated as a different korban, and now you offered it up as a korban Pesach. Eino din shei chayiv. Certainly you should be chayiv for that. Amar Rabbi Yoshua lo. Im amrit bepesach sheshino b'davar aser, tomar bizvachim sheshino b'davar mutar. Rabbi Yeshua says it's different. If you took a Pesach and you offered it up for another sacrificial purpose, you offered it up for something that is aser on Shabbos. But if you took another sacrifice that was designated for a different type of korban, and you offered it up for Pesach, so you switched it, but you switched it for something that is permitted to be offered on Shabbos, you certainly shouldn't be chayiv. Amar li Rabbi Elazar will say, a murei tzibor yochichu. Offering up of sacrificial parts, some communal offerings will prove this. Shein mutar and lishman. So ultimately, going to both say they are mutar if shechted lishma, vashochet lishman chayiv. But yet ultimately, again, if you shechted lishman, both say we're going to see in the Gemara exactly what all of these arguments are. If you shechted lishman, you're chayiv. Amar Rabbi Yoshua lo im amrit be murei tzibor sheishlan kitzla. See, I will say karbanos tzibor are different. Why? Because it will say, how many karbanos tzibor are offered up? One of each type, right? Communal offerings, there's one korban per type. Tomar bePesach she'en lo kitzva. Yet a korban Pesach, Rabbi said, there is no limit. Meaning what that means is, multiple karbanos Pesach are offered up. Rabbi Meir Omer, af hashochit l'shem emurei tzibor pater. Rabbi Meir actually says, Rabbi say, if you shecht an animal on Shabbos, and you shecht it l'shem korban tzibor, a particular type of korban tzibor that could be offered up on Shabbos, halach l'maisa, Rabbi Meir holds that you are pater. So Rabbi say, so again, what we are introduced to over here is a fascinating concept of Toeh bidvar mitzvah. Rabbi Yeshua is, so again, in general, we assume if you violate Shabbos accidentally, you're chayiv chatos. Rabbi Yeshua says it depends. If your accidental act really resembles a mitzvah in a comprehensive way, you're pater. Now, the distinction between shogeg and ta b'dvar mitzvah is what the Gemara is going to have to clarify a little bit. Let's finish the Mishnah. Shachtu shaliach lav shalol menuyav. If you went ahead and you shechted it on Shabbos, you shechted a korban pesach shalol ochlav shalol menuyav. For people who can't eat the korban, let's say someone who's old, sick, shalol menuyav. People who are not part of the chabura, la'areilin, uncircumcised, l'tmein, people who are tamei chayiv. Because remember again, what you've effectively done is you've shechted a korban on Shabbos that is not fit for consumption. So you violated Shabbos. The ochlav shal yachlav, l'mnir shal l'menuyav, l'mulam l'ari, l'mtmei l'tamor and pater. Rabbi say, if halacha l'maisa, you shechted a korban pesach, and remember, you shechted it for a group of people who can eat it and can't eat it. People who are tamei and are tar. People who are part of the chabura, not part of the chabura. People who are circumcised, uncircumcised, then you're pater. Because you're also, remember again, halacha l'maisa, as long as someone in that group can eat the korban pesach, then your shchita is warranted. Last case, shachtov and imtzabal mum chayiv. We'll say, watch this. Let's say you shecht a korban pesach, and after you shecht it, you discover a mum. Now, we'll say that mum they're describing over here is an external mum. A mum that you should have seen before the korban. So after I shecht the korban, I find the animal has a wart. Let's say we saw it before. That's a mum. I should have seen it before, so the animal's invalid. I should have seen it before, but I didn't do a close enough examination. I'm chayiv. In other words, I have accidentally violated Shabbos. Shachtov and imsa treifa b'seiser pater. But I will say, if I shechted the animal, it had no external mum, but then I shecht that, I open it up and I find that it's a treifa. So if Rabbi say, really the animal is invalid for consumption, I'm pater. Well, obviously, why am I pater? Because that I could not have foreseen. I could not have foreseen. Shachtu v'nodu shemashchua bailem es yadam, o shemesu o shenitmu pater, b'mnei sheshachar bershas. Rabbi say, listen to the following case. What happens if halacha l'maisa, I shecht the korban, and then I find out after I shechted that all of the members of my chabura switched chaburas. They switched chaburas. So I'll say, so it turns out I shechted a korban pesach not for a chabura, which is an illegal act. I'm pater. Why am I pater? But I'll say, common theme. You could only be chayiv for things that are in your control. So if there was a mum on the animal, but you didn't pay enough attention, so therefore you missed the mum before you shechted it, that's your chayiv for. But let's say if you shechted and you find an internal mum, the animal's a treifa, or you shechted thinking you had a chabura, and then after you shechted, you find out that halacha l'maisa, there's no more chabura. There's no more chabura. So we'll say in that case, halacha l'maisa, in that situation, those are situations you could not have controlled, and therefore halacha l'maisa, you will be pater. Shabbos says, so therefore the Mishnah introduces us to this concept of ta'a b'dvar mitzvah, which we'll have to see the scope of it. The distinction between a shogeg and a shogeg that resembles, a shogeg that you're chayiv for, and a shogeg that resembles the mitzvah enough that you're not going to be chayiv for it. Furthermore, again, you're chayiv for situations that you could have foreseen and prevented, and of course, pater for ones that you could have not. Shkach, we'll stop over here.